The engine ticked as it cooled in the dark parking lot. It was a rhythmic, metallic sound, counting down the seconds of his restraint. Chikondi gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He tried to pull his hands away, but his muscles refused the command, locked in a rigid, desperate hold. His pulse hammered against his temples, a frantic, irregular beat that echoed the chaos inside his chest. The car was a tomb of his own making. He stared through the windshield at the empty asphalt, his breath coming in shallow, jagged bursts. Every time he tried to relax his grip, the urge to leave, to drive until the road ended, surged back with renewed force. He squeezed harder. The leather groaned under the pressure of his fingers. He was fighting a war against his own impulses, and the silence of the cabin was losing the battle. He leaned his forehead against the top of the wheel, closing his eyes to shut out the darkness, but the sensation of being trapped only intensified. He remained motionless, a statue of pure, vibrating tension, anchored to the spot by the sheer weight of his own resistance. A neon sign from a nearby bar flickered to life across the parking lot. The light pulsed in a steady, rhythmic cadence, casting a sharp, hypnotic glow across the dashboard. Chikondi watched the light wash over the plastic surfaces, turning the interior into a shifting landscape of shadow and color. The flicker seemed to sync with the hammering in his temples, drawing his focus away from the steering wheel and toward the world outside. His fingers twitched. The urge to numb the noise in his head was no longer just a thought. It was a physical weight, a heavy, leaden pressure pressing down on his chest. It made every movement feel like wading through deep water. He shifted his weight, and the seat groaned beneath him. He looked at the door handle, his hand hovering in the stagnant air of the cabin. His fingers trembled, caught between the pull of the dark road and the stillness of the car. He reached out, his skin brushing the cold metal of the handle. The temptation to open the door, to step out and disappear into the night, felt like a physical force pulling at his arm. He gripped the handle, his knuckles straining, the weight of his desire to escape becoming almost too heavy to bear. He held his breath, staring at the latch, waiting for the final push to break his resolve. His hand tightened around the cold metal of the door handle, ready to push. At that exact second, the center console erupted in a sharp blue-white glare. The phone screen lit up, cutting through the dim cabin like a flare. Chikondi froze. The movement of his arm halted mid-push. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his fingers curling into his palm. He looked down. A single notification sat on the screen, clear and steady. Thandiwe. The text read, "Come home safe." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. They were a tether, a quiet, insistent anchor pulling against the tide of his urge to vanish. He stared at the glowing letters for a full minute, the light reflecting in his eyes. The silence of the car, once a vacuum waiting to be filled by his escape, now felt suffocating. The neon light from the bar continued to pulse outside, but it had lost its hypnotic grip. The screen remained bright, a beacon of domestic expectation. He breathed in, the air tasting of stale plastic and cold night. He only watched the screen, caught in the crossfire between his shadow and her hope. The silence inside the car pressed against his eardrums, thick and immovable. Chikondi let out a jagged, sharp breath that rattled in his throat. He did not look at the phone again. Instead, he grabbed the device and shoved it into the center console, the plastic clicking as it slid out of sight. The act felt final, a physical severing of the tether that had held him in the dark parking lot. He reached for the ignition. His hand was steady now, the tremor gone, replaced by a cold, singular focus. He turned the key. The engine roared to life, a sudden, violent sound that shattered the hypnotic pulse of the neon light outside. The vibration traveled through the steering wheel and into his palms, grounding him. He shifted the gear into drive, the mechanical clunk echoing in the small space. He did not look back at the bar or the shadows that had nearly claimed his night. He pressed his foot down, and the car lurched forward, tires crunching over the gravel. As he pulled out of the lot and onto the main road, he kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The streetlights blurred into long golden streaks as he accelerated. Every mile covered was a deliberate step away from the void. He was moving toward the house. The house was unnervingly quiet. Chikondi stepped inside, the floorboards barely creaking under his weight. Thandiwe sat at the kitchen table, a book resting open before her. She closed it the moment he crossed the threshold. He walked past her to the sink, turning the tap until the water ran cold. He splashed his face, the shock of the temperature pulling him back into the room. He leaned his weight against the counter, his shoulders dropping. "I have been struggling," he whispered. The words hung in the air, raw and exposed. Thandiwe stood up, her chair scraping against the tile. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze steady. "With what?" she asked. He looked toward the dark window, watching his own reflection in the glass. "Not with the drink itself," he said, his voice tight, "but with the need to disappear." He braced his hands against the edge of the counter, waiting for the sharp sting of her anger. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a firm hand on his arm. She pulled him into a steady, unyielding embrace. "We are past that," she said. "We face the shadows together." The embrace ended, but the resolve remained. Chikondi looked around the living room, seeing the space with new eyes. It was filled with the debris of their distraction, discarded magazines, charging cables, and the omnipresent glow of screens. He walked to the coffee table and swept the clutter into a pile. Thandiwe joined him, her movements purposeful. They worked in silence, moving furniture to open the floor space. They carried the stack of devices into the hallway and shut the door. The acoustics of the room changed instantly. The hum of the house seemed to drop away. They pulled 2 chairs into the center of the floor. There was no television to fill the gaps, no phone to check for notifications. They sat, the silence no longer a void, but a canvas. Chikondi leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He spoke of the day, not the big fears, but the small, grinding frustrations. Thandiwe listened, her posture open, her attention fixed entirely on him. The air was clear, and the truth was the only thing left. The habit pulled him toward the parking lot, a gravitational force he had obeyed for years. Chikondi walked past the rows of idling vehicles, the engine heat radiating against his shins. He stopped at the edge of the asphalt. He looked at his car, then turned his back on it. He walked toward the park entrance instead. The transition was jarring at first. The park was not silent. It was alive with a different frequency. He stepped onto the grass, the ground yielding slightly under his boots. He stopped walking and stood still. For the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone to fill the gap. He looked up. The wind moved through the canopy above, a rhythmic rushing sound that swept through the branches. He watched the leaves, their edges turning gold and brown, fluttering in the gusts. He focused on the texture of the bark on a nearby oak, the rough ridges pressing against his fingertips. He was not escaping, he was arriving. He walked deeper into the trees, his eyes tracking the movement of light across the forest floor. The kitchen became their new center of gravity. Chikondi stood at the counter, the wooden handle of the knife cool and steady in his grip. Thandiwe moved beside him, the rhythmic sound of her chopping vegetables blending with the low hiss of the stove. The air grew heavy with the sharp, warm scent of crushed garlic and toasted cumin, a fragrance that filled the room and pushed back the stale remnants of his past anxieties. He watched the steam rise from the pot, swirling in the light, and realized he was not waiting for the meal to end so he could leave. He was here, he was active, he was present. Every movement, the stirring of the sauce, the seasoning of the pan, the simple act of setting the table felt like a deliberate reclaiming of his own time. He looked at the walls, no longer seeing the boundaries of a cage, but the edges of a shared life. The urge to disappear, once a constant, crushing weight, had thinned. He reached for a bowl, his hand steady, and passed it to Thandiwe. She smiled, and the tension that had lived in his shoulders for years finally began to dissipate. He was no longer resisting a habit. He was constructing a reality that felt like home. The kitchen was warm, the work was shared, and for the first time, He felt no desire to run. By the end of the month, the house had changed. The silence, that once felt like a suffocating shroud, had transformed into something light, open, and peaceful. Chikondi stood in the living room as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, steady shadows across the floor. He listened. There was no hum of anxiety, no phantom urge to reach for his keys, no sudden impulse to vanish into the dark. The air in the room felt still, held in place by the rhythm of their new life. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, watching the headlights pass by. Before, those lights had been a siren call, a promise of escape. Now, they were just lights. He turned back to the room. The space they had cleared of clutter remained open, a physical manifestation of the clarity he had found. He realized then that the foundation they had built was not just a temporary fix. It was a structure capable of holding the weight of their lives. He pulled a chair out and sat down, his muscles loose, his breathing deep and slow. Thandiwe walked in, saw him there, and simply sat in the chair across from him. They did not need to fill the quiet with talk. The stillness was enough. He looked at his hands, resting flat on the table, and felt the solid reality of the wood beneath his palms. The restlessness that had defined his existence for years had finally exhausted itself. He was not waiting for the next moment to arrive. He was living in the current one. He felt grounded, anchored by the simple, undeniable fact that he was exactly where he belonged. There was nowhere else he needed to run.